So thank you today for joining us or joining me for this presentation around a decision framework that I like to use when helping people make better decisions with their money. We call it our sort of the DURT method. So hence the title of the presentation, The Dirty Business of Decision Making. So quick disclaimer, not really an issue today. We won't be covering anything in particular around financial products, but nothing we're going to cover today will be advice. It's very much general information and background stuff only. So please don't make any choices or decisions based on what we cover today. And we are recording the presentation. We are in the process of chopping up the other presentations we've already done. So they'll be starting to get posted now as well. And all the webinars we're recording are being posted on our YouTube channel as well for future reference. And if you have anybody you think might benefit from what we're covering, feel free to share it. Okay. So where all this has come from is I've been a financial advisor now for nearly 16 years. And over the course of that career, I've spent a lot of time helping people make better choices. And early on in my career, it was really easy. The decisions were really simple, really straightforward. It was really black and white. Here's a good option, here's a bad option, take the good option every time. As the complexity of the advice that I've been giving the people that we're working with, the development of the profession has continued on, those black and white choices and decisions are becoming less and less frequent. And what I'm finding is that we are confronting, which is a good thing, we are confronting more frequently decisions that probably sit in that grey area more than purely black and white. And so we have a method we use in our advice process that helps us come to a recommendation for people around making those decisions and those choices. So it's that shift away from black and white, transparently simple advice recommendations to things that are carrying a lot more nuance, a lot more detail, a lot more pros and cons to consider, which can be quite overwhelming. And I think for a lot of people that aren't seeking advice, that can be a really big hurdle to starting to make those choices around money. We see a lot of people that are just continuing along out of inertia, continuing along with momentum, but not really going in any particular direction because the decisions are just too difficult. They're just too complicated. So as background to this as well, one of my objectives for the people we work with is to help them make those decisions and make those choices, but to make them with intention, make them with a clear consideration of what they're looking at and what the potential consequences could be, and with an awareness of what it means for their personal situation. So I was introduced to a book, I haven't read it yet, but called The Pathless Path, which is all about kind of the default definition of success that we each find in a particular niche or cohort that we're in. So the example given was a professional accounting practice. The path for success there is, come as a junior, become a senior, become a manager, work towards partnership. And that's the default pathway. And the reason I mention that is what I like to do and what I think is really valuable is questioning that default pathway, because at each of those inflection points, people can make a decision. And it doesn't have to be the default one that we make by reflex or just because we're following the herd to an extent. I'd like to help people interrogate and query those decision points and put them in the context of what they want out of their life. And often, they'll follow the same path, but at least it's with that intention, with that consideration, with that awareness. But in doing that, it helps, I find, to have a framework around how we're approaching those decision discussions. And the one that I've landed on, the one that I quite like to use, is the DURT, D-U-R-T framework, which is we look at the downsides, the upsides, the risks, and the trade-offs. Now, handily, it obviously forms a nice, easy to say acronym, but there is a reason I start with the downsides first. It's not just my natural cynicism and skepticism. Quite often when we see people, they are excited about the potential of an opportunity or an event or something that's coming along their way. And it's really easy to get swept up in that. The new business idea, the new job idea, the new house, the new product, however it is. And that's completely fine. But I think my role as a professional advisor is to come at it from the other direction. What can go wrong? Be that sort of negative Nelly and try to rain on the parade a little bit, just to proof, stress test it. Is there a provable and achievable outcome that we can chase here? So it's not just that we're starting because it sounds good and it's easier than saying you did it. We do deliberately start from the downsides because I think if we can identify them clearly, communicate them clearly, then it helps make the decision seem a lot more realistic. So the four aspects of the DURT framework are the downsides, the upsides, the risks, and the trade-offs. And this feeds in this has come directly from the methodology we use when we're preparing and providing advice to people. So if you've ever worked with a financial advisor, you will have received a statement of advice. And the statement of advice is a document. We've covered this previously, but it's basically, here's where you are now, here's what you want to achieve, here's what we recommend, here are the other considerations. The other considerations are where this fits in. So we're recommending somebody change super fund. There's always an attachment to that that says, we're recommending this, here are the reasons why, but here are the other considerations, here are the downsides, and here are the benefits, but here are the risks, and here are the trade-offs. Because reflecting back again on that lack of black and white decisions, a lot of our options are, do this because this is much better for you, but you need to be aware of this potential cost. It's actually got to the point where I'm quite skeptical of black and white advice. We review advice occasionally for clients that come along or for other advisors. And when the advice is positioned as a complete fait accompli, like just, yep, here's what you should do, no brainer, absolutely clear, it always gets my alarm bells ringing, because that's very rarely the case. It still happens. If you're in a real dog of a super fund or a really bad insurance policy, moving is going to be to your unmitigated benefit. But often there's more to it than that. And we'll hop into that in a second. So this is just the framework we use to help prepare those recommendations. And the focus for all of that when we're doing it is we're trying to find something on balance, which I'll come to in a sec. But first, some definitions. So when we're talking about downsides, we're talking about the reasonably foreseeable negative impacts of the choice that people can make. So there's a few key points there. The reasonably foreseeable aspect, I think, is quite important. We ignore, or we don't include, or we can't include things like, complete black swan events. So changing super funds, perhaps the super fund you move to goes broke, APRA needs to step in, cover their liabilities, and you spread across to another different super fund. That is not a reasonably foreseeable outcome. So it's not something we include in our analysis. Our analysis would be 8 feet long. But also needs to be the negative impacts of the choice. And the part of the reason we do this is so that then we can sort of weigh up the positives and the negatives. So it's really important that we're clear on that aspect here. But so there needs to be a negative impact of the choice that we're recommending people make, and that needs to be a reasonably foreseeable one. Now, the reason I'm going through this, again, we approach it when we're preparing advice, but my hope is that it can also act as a tool for the people watching this to help them approach some of these bigger decisions. Because I think pros and cons is a good one. Risks and benefits, or costs and benefits, that's a good one. But this captures, I think, a few more of the other aspects of making big decisions. The other one is the upsides. So this is where, again, that bias kicks in, and we use a conservative assessment of the likely benefits of the option. So we've advised some people over the years, increasingly frequently, that have been given the opportunity of buying the business they work for or buying another business. And so they come in and they've got an offer document, which is fantastic, and it lists all the benefits of the positive, wonderful business that they could be buying. And there's always a set of cash flow projections in there. And that always makes the business look like you're buying it when it's a baby business and it's eventually going to become Google within 5 years. We put a deliberate dampener on that. And I think it's important that we all do that when we're making these financial decisions or any big decisions. I believe it's better to underestimate the positives and overestimate the negatives, so that then you're limiting the impact of disappointment. So if you go into something thinking that it's all going to be all shiny and rainbows and unicorns all the time, that's probably not going to be the case. Most financial or big life decisions have some gray in it. So if you're going in thinking it's going to be 100% wonderful and it's only 90% wonderful, you have a good chance of being disappointed. But I feel, and again, might just be my natural cynicism, but I feel like if you're going in with tempered expectations, it gives you a greater clarity when you're making the choice as well. So it's definitely the approach we take when we're preparing our advice. The other one is risks. This is a big thing in advice. Any financial decision or move you make carries with it risk. And risk is a whole nother big discussion that we'll cover off in another day, because it's a huge spectrum of events. So, I like the framework when I'm looking at risks of it being a function of likelihood and impact. By which I mean, is it a big risk that's unlikely to happen? Or is it a little risk that's really likely to happen? And what's the impact of all of that? And the sort of the classic example here is an example, the risk of your house burning down. Now, the likelihood of that statistically is actually really low, but yet we all have insurance because the impact of that happening would be enormous. So huge impact multiplied by a low likelihood, statistically speaking, actually would make that a small risk. But the impact is so big that we offset it where we can with insurance. So we take a similar approach when we're looking at preparing advice for people. So we look at the likely and potential risks that they'll be accepting by taking on a recommendation. So again, changing super funds. A likely risk of doing that is that the investments that you move into might underperform the investments that you're leaving. And that happens. There's no real way to avoid that. It's just a risk that you need to accept. Now, how likely is that risk and what is the impact of that risk is a different matter. Another big risk, particularly if we're changing, say, insurance policies, the risks of things going wrong at claim time. And we'll explore that in a second in one of the examples that we'll go through. I'll just have a quick check over here. Great. And the final item that we look at when we're sort of running decisions through this framework are the trade-offs that are involved. And these are the items to consider or to think about when you're balancing off the costs and the benefits. So it's kind of, what's the downsides versus the upsides? How do I feel about that? What are the risks versus the upsides? How does it all interplay? And an example of this is changing, I'll stick to the same example, but changing super funds. So the trade-off can be, well, I'm moving to a super fund that's cheaper, it's easier to use, it's going to lead to a higher balance for me at retirement. But the administrative hassle of changing and letting my payroll department know that I'm changing super funds and getting new details, it's a real pain in the neck. That's kind of a trade-off. Is the trade-off worth it? It's really up to you to decide. In my opinion, it does, so therefore that's what we recommend. Insurance is another big one that we'll hop to in a sec. Is it worth going to a cheaper insurance policy to save money, but it's lower quality? Where is that sort of sit in the suitability spectrum? And the big point, and I've alluded to it earlier, when we're preparing this advice, our legal duty is to meeting people's best interests, which has a conclusiveness and a finality that can be quite hard to reach when you're preparing advice. But when you dig into that, the standard is, on balance, is our advice going to improve a person's position? Is it going to be in their best interests on balance? And that's really where that trade-off point comes through. So that discussion about the insurance change. Person A, it might be a dreadful idea to change insurance policy. Now, they may not see any benefit in losing those particular features and values simply for saving money. So in that case, in their instance, on balance, they're better off to keep the insurance, but cop the trade-off of paying the higher premium. Person B, however, might be incredibly cost-conscious, really limited budget, and they can no longer afford the blue ribbon top shelf insurance policy. So downgrading to bring in the cost below where it is now, that's an acceptable trade-off. So on balance, it's in their interests to make sure that it actually reflects what they need to do. And this is where I think our occupation or our profession can get things wrong sometimes. There is no such thing as universal advice. There's no such thing as one size fits all. It needs to be very tailored and very particular and very bespoke. And to anybody who has worked with an advisor in the past, just make sure that is what you're getting, that the advice has been really specifically tailored to your best interests. Again, with those advice reviews that we do, sometimes we see things, I don't know, people get channeled into certain products or channeled into certain solutions regardless of the problem. Every advice firm has a hammer, it seems, and therefore everything looks like a nail. It needs to be really bespoke and tailored. So it's very much that idea of on balance, and that applies through to if you're using this framework for your own decision making as well. There can be a pressure or an inclination to think that there must be a right answer. I've been given a choice, a decision, a dilemma. There must be a right solution here, and if I just think about it hard enough, ask enough people, look around enough, read enough, flick around on social media enough, I will find that right answer. And the unfortunate realization I'm coming to as I get older is that often there isn't a right answer. There's a better answer. And so this concept of it being an unbalanced decision, I think is really critical when you're approaching it. Now, the downside of that is sometimes the unbalance of playing the probabilities doesn't play out the way you want it to. So our person B that we were talking about before, who opt to go the cheaper insurance policy to keep some sort of coverage, on balance, that is completely in their best interests. But if 5 years down the track, they have a claim that they would have been paid for under the old event and not the new event, that's a really, really bad outcome. But yet on balance, they made the decision that was most appropriate for them and in their best interest with the information they had on hand at the time. So unfortunately, some of these decisions also just don't work out. So what we're trying to do with this framework is to make it easier for people to make consistent decisions in line with their interests, based on the information they have at the moment. It is not and cannot ever be a guarantee that you'll be finding the right answer each time. We are all slaves to probability in life, and sometimes probability, no matter how much we work on it, doesn't go our way. So let's talk about some examples. First example here, I have 3 different superannuation accounts. Should I consolidate them into one fund? This is probably often an example of knee-jerk advice. So the knee-jerk or default reaction amongst advisors has always been, and I think this is extended to the broader public as well, if you have multiple super funds, you should combine them into one and save fees. The reality is, as with everything else, a lot more nuanced than that. Sometimes it can be a good idea, sometimes it can be a terrible idea. So the framework that we look at when we're analysing this kind of option for people, what are the downsides? So changing super funds, you will often have to sell down the investments that are contained in the fund. And that can trigger some tax liabilities if you have some capital gains in there, or if you've got some other charges that might apply. So maybe you get stuck with brokerage, maybe buy sells on the funds that you own within the fund to kick in. So those can be relatively expensive costs. We disclose them in the document and the advice that we give. But sometimes if you're doing it yourself, it can be quite hidden as well. So keep in mind that super funds still pay. Super fund pays 15% tax on earnings, income, and capital, but you get a discount within the super fund of 1/3 of the tax rate. So essentially, you pay 10% tax on capital gains. So if you've had a fund for a while and it's been 10 years, for instance, and you've got a fair capital gain in there, 10% of that might come off the top and go towards tax. The big one and the most impactful one that I've seen through reading a lot of the ombudsman decisions and just being around advice for a while is the loss of insurance. So quite frequently, 3 different super funds, you might have 3 different life insurances, disability insurances, income insurances, and you consolidate them all into the whiz-bang ABC super fund because it's a lot cheaper. But you've now lost all that insurance. So you either need to go without that insurance, which is an option, or try to find new insurance if you can. Now, that sounds quite easy in theory, but if you've had a health event, if you've had any sort of deterioration in your health, if you've had really a history of stress or anything like that, getting that new cover can be really difficult, to the point where for a lot of people, they cannot get new cover. So people have gone from a scenario where maybe across 3 funds, they've got $600,000 of life cover, merged all that super into ABC super, no cover at all, and then passed away. That is a terrible outcome, a huge downside for their family. So that loss of insurance is for us a really big red flag. It's a big break for us, a BRAKE break, when we're looking at superannuation switching advice for people, because it often can't be fixed. It's kind of a one-way street. The other downside is that it is, particularly if you're doing it yourself, it's a huge administrative hassle. We're dealing with some people at the moment. She has 2 super funds. One was put in place with her very first job. So she was 16, got a new job, I think it was at Macca's, and got a new super fund set up. But her boss at the time spelled her surname wrong. So that's really quite hard to fix. The other fund came through as part of a divorce settlement, and it's in her married name, but she's now changed her name. But the paperwork that set up the divorce settlement, she didn't sign it. It was done through the court orders. So it's a real mess. Now, we've put probably 8 to 10 hours of administrative work into that just to try to get that resolved, and we're getting pretty close. But the reason I mention that is anything to do with super where you're making changes is administratively a hassle, particularly if you're looking to leave a super fund. So, cynical hat on, they make that a lot harder than joining them for whatever reason that may be. That's before you start thinking about, okay, well, which are the funds that I'm consolidating into? Will I be making my work contributions to? Who do I have to notify of that at work? Is there that form I have to fill out? How do I do that? None of it is insurmountable. It just takes persistence, transparency, good note taking. But it is a hassle. So we count that as a downside. The upside, though, can be some pretty significant fee savings. I caught up with some clients that we helped 5 or 6 years ago. We moved them out of a quite expensive super fund. And at the time, the shift saved them about $4,500. So we then sort of disengaged. There wasn't any more work for us to do for them. And we caught up with again after about 5 years. We've recalculated the benefit of that fee saving to them over that 5-year period. And it's close to $30,000 we've saved them in fees by making that change to a cheaper super fund. Unabashedly proud of that benefit for them, because that, in their particular case, is about 8 months worth of extra retirement income before we allow for any compounding. So the savings that you can generate by moving to a cheaper super fund should not be sniffed at. Sometimes the super fund you're moving to will have better, different, more diverse investment options. So some of the industry funds, although they've gotten a bit better lately, some of them have very limited investment menus. It's kind of, conservative, moderate, balanced growth, high growth shares. For some people, that's completely perfect. Arguably, for most people, that's completely adequate. But for some people, they want more control, they want more detail, they want to be able to really establish, really good, strong portfolios. That's just not achievable with those super funds. So that's an upside of moving as well. And, once you have gone through that administrative hassle of consolidating down to the fund, year 2, 3, 5, 10 should be a lot simpler because you've only got the one fund. So instead of running, 2 funds at the same time, you've got just the one. And that does make life a little bit easier, less mail. And then you've got the risks. So you've got the risks that come up with investment choice. You've got timing risk. That means that I move out of super fund A on Monday, and by the time the money gets across to super fund B on Wednesday, that's when the money actually appears in the account. On Tuesday, there's the very minor risk that we have a complete market meltdown. So GFC hits on the Tuesday, on Wednesday, your money's worth a lot less. In that instance, actually, it'd be to the benefit of you because you'd be buying more units. So probably the other way around, we have a market boom on the Tuesday, so you're buying fewer units when you get back in. There's a very small provider risk. So, for instance, the provider you choose to use or the super fund you move to could cause hassles, cause issues. We have some pretty strong legislative protections in Australia, but it's still a risk. The biggest risk with superannuation is always going to be a legislative risk. Politicians and political parties don't like leaving super alone, so they always mess around with it. And finally, the trade-offs are that discussion you should be having with your advisor, but still have with yourself. How do I weigh this up? What is the cost of changing? What are those downsides versus the benefits and the upsides? What's the value of that hassle now? It could take 6 months to get this done compared to the simplicity of the future. And that decision, I like to have that discussion with people. I tend not to advise people based on it, to tell people what the trade-off they should choose is. It very much needs to be a personal thing. I have an older income protection policy. Should I keep it or move to a newer one that costs less? There is some background here. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2021, the regulator mandated some changes to income protection policies that essentially downgraded the quality of any new policy to make them more profitable for insurers. Insurers were offering these policies with all these bells and whistles, but they weren't pricing them properly, so they were losing money. The value or otherwise of a government regulator stepping in to correct a public or private company's mistakes, I'll leave to others to work through. But there's a point. There's a threshold in I think it was November 2021, where every new income protection policy after that is demonstrably inferior to the ones that were available beforehand. It should be cheaper, but inferior. So where we're seeing a lot of people sort of have to make choices now is, I have this whiz-bang policy, but it's costing me a fortune. Those cheaper policies available now, I know they're worse, but they're a lot cheaper. And I need to save money because everything's dear. And what do I do? So here's where we run through that downsides, upsides, risks, and trade-offs discussion and advice process. So, the big downsides here are you are downgrading benefits to the point where making a successful claim becomes less likely. And then the quantum or the benefit of that claim being paid is less than it would be. Like, that's a huge downside. That is a huge negative impact. You'll have to go through a new underwriting process. So if you've had any kind of health events or any changes happen since you got the new policy, you will be assessed by an underwriter, and they may apply new conditions to the policies. So a common one here is, I take out income protection when I'm 35 and I'm fit and in good health, or more accurately, just haven't seen a doctor. And I'm now 42, but a couple of years ago, I had a really bad back pain. I did my back doing something. All healed now, but it's there. I will then most likely get a back exclusion on any new coverage. Now, the reason you get a back exclusion is you're a higher likelihood of claiming because of something related to the back. So you will, if you go down this path, no longer be covered for something that's more likely to occur. So this is a huge downside to accept when you're making this kind of change. And by moving to a cheaper policy, there's no guarantee that next year that policy will remain cheaper. So unfortunately, insurers have a long track record of getting people in cheap and then ramping up the price over the next couple of years. Huge downsides. The upsides, though, unavoidably, for people who are on a limited budget but need some level of coverage, it will be cheaper making this change. We're seeing savings of 10, 20, 30% by moving to an inferior policy. It's hard to recommend that, truth be told, but when it's in somebody's best interest to move to something that's going to save their family money, it becomes a bit easier. And the other upside might be you really dislike your insurer. We have quite a few people that have a hate relationship with their insurer. This will move you away from them. The risks, like a flag, you've got some underwriting issues. Claiming can be a bit more difficult. There's no quantifiable data around this, and it's primarily anecdotal. But I think the argument stacks up that if you have a policy with an insurer for 20 years versus 20 months, the claims process for the 20-year policy is likely to be easier. You are more likely, I think, to get the benefit of the doubt when you're going through the assessment. I can't prove that. That's completely opinion-based, but that's the feeling I have from the claims I've seen. You have the issue around non-disclosure risk. So that has also changed. That's a rabbit hole we won't go down, but you are obligated to tell the truth and give the insurer information that they would rely on to make an assessment. It's kind of easy to miss some of that stuff. You might forget about that high blood pressure test you had 5 years ago, or some people are a bit cheeky, but we've had people forget. What was the worst one we had? We had one that had a blood test that sort of showed that they may have had a heart attack, and they forgot that. So there's some sketchy stuff there, but still a risk. And again, that pricing risk, that the pricing could move against you. So we're back in trade-off territory where people need to start thinking and start, working out, weighing up in their mind, what's more important to me and what's going to be in my better interests? To save money now or lose the benefits later? A new insurer versus the devil I know. What's the approach there? And that can be kind of difficult, and we talk a little bit later on about choice context. Because what we're really talking about here is making a decision, almost making a permanent decision based on a temporary state of affairs. So, if you're 40, 62-year-old you might really need those extra benefits that they have. But 40 to 61-year-old you needs to find a way to pay for that. So there's an immediate tension there that needs to be resolved. And that can be really difficult. And the final example we'll work through today is this one. Should I retire early so that I can enjoy it while I can, or keep working to make sure I have enough funds? And this is one we're coming across a fair bit. Should I enjoy my money now while I'm in good health, or should I prioritize my longer-term late life security? So these examples here, this is relating to retiring early. So if you were to decide to retire early, the downside are you will always, in my experience, be somewhat fearful of running out of money. And that can translate into underspending. It can translate into scrimping and sacrifice when maybe you don't need to. But it's a subconscious feeling or need that people can carry with them when they retire early. The other one can be prematurely leaving the workforce, which sounds silly. You're retiring early, that's what you want to do. But there are a lot of benefits and positives that come from working, socially, in terms of your self-esteem, in terms of your competence, in terms of your dexterity, all of these things. Leaving the workforce early turns the tap off on those positives pretty quickly. That's another consideration. The upside is you get to retire early. Yeah, you're hitting the road early. You're taking the holidays early. You're spending all the time with the grandkids early. These are huge and wonderful upsides, but they come at a cost. And one of those costs is the risks that are involved. There is a very real risk of running out of funds too early. And for a lot of people, they dread the idea of, turning 78 and relying completely on the $28,000 a year single age pension. Another fear that people have, so not so much a fear as a risk, is the chance of, losing your health early on. So, it's not unusual for people's health to kind of deteriorate in their late 60s or early 70s. That can limit the enjoyment you can have in that early retirement, which kind of eliminates the benefit of that worry about money. You kind of lost the upside, but you're still stuck with the downside. That's a risk. So the trade-off that people need to work through then is, do I want that greater enjoyment earlier, or do I want to be more confident I'm not going to run out of money? I met with some people the other day who have had a very eventful life. They've done a lot of travel. He was a minister in, but one of the big denomination churches. And so they've spent a lot of time traveling around Australia, living in different communities. They've traveled through the outback. They've traveled through the territories. And so when we talk about what their retirement looks like, it's not going to be a lot of travel. They've brought that enjoyment forward. So in their case, it's more about fulfillment, meaning, and security. Which brings us to the point, this approach has some limitations. And one of those limitations is that, again, there's no universally right advice. These frameworks are not, or this framework is not an equation where you pop in the variables and it spits out the same answer. You and I will very likely get different answers if we run the exercise on the same variables. Which I think of it and I look at it as a person's choice context. And I'm sure there is a better term for that. I'm sure the psychological researchers out there have a much better phrase for it. But when we're looking at advice for people, their choice context is why they make the decisions that they make. Which what we're really talking about here is, what are you bringing to the table when you're making these big decisions? And this is what makes advice so, this is why it makes it so critical that advice is individualized, in my opinion. Because there's a blog post that's going out around the same topic, and we go into a lot of detail around 2 case studies. But you've got person A and person B. At the surface level, they're the same. Mid-40s, 2.4 kids, 2 cars, big mortgage, investment property, superannuation, same income, same earnings, same expenses. Surface level, same person, they should get the same advice or make the same decisions. But when you start looking into their choice context, one grew up wealthy, one grew up making ends meet, barely making ends meet. One is an only child, one is a family, in a family of 4. So their considerations around inheritances and things like that are very different. One spent their 20s traveling, the other spent their 20s working in the family business. So we start looking at this choice context. And the reason these factors are relevant is that then shapes their perspectives on money. And when we're talking about a choice context, what we're trying to gauge here or get an idea of really is people's different perspectives, their different histories, their different beliefs about money. So for some people, money is a means to an end. It pays for the life they want to have. For some people, money is a measure of their worth. Their ego is tied up in their wealth. And none of these are negative. These are all neutral perspectives and viewpoints. But the vehicles that they can be used as demonstrations of these feelings can be positive and negative. But so everyone has different beliefs. And finally, people have different goals and objectives. So talking about something like retirement, So two people are looking to retire. They want to retire at 60. Yeah. But what if they want to retire on different amounts? What if they have different family needs, priorities? Perhaps one has a spouse who is completely dependent on them for support. The other one has a spouse who wants to keep working and earning a high income. So in each of these cases and examples that I'm flagging, our advice would be tailored to what people are needing. Because, as I've said a few times, there is simply no such thing as universally right advice. And this is where I think things like that super consolidation idea can be dangerous for people, because you hear on the news or on breakfast radio or on some of the superannuation ads or the articles in the paper, the default has become you should consolidate your super funds. And yeah, in many occasions that's the right advice, but not universally. For many people, changing super funds is a terrible idea. So that's why it needs to be really quite considered, which is why we use this framework to try to explore what a considered and intentional decision looks like there. So it's a limitation of this framework, is that it does need to be very tailored to your individual choice context. Another limitation is, if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, he and his writing partner at the time, Amos Tversky, did a huge amount of work around biases and the cognitive path we follow when we're making choices. Choice architecture, I think. No, that wasn't there. Heuristics, that's what they called it. Heuristics is the way that people make decisions. And what he did, I think Amos passed away quite a while ago, but Daniel Kahneman's then moved on and he's written a book. This is an amazing book. If you get a chance to read it, it's not a short book, but very, very eye-opening. And what it essentially argues is that there's two ways that people make decisions. There's two ways that people think. There's system one and system two. System one is kind of our lizard brain. Instinctive, rapid, built on presumptions and assumptions and biases, but it's an immediate decision. From something as simple as seeing something kind of brown and flexible looking on the bushwalking track you're on and thinking it's a snake and jumping away, to making a snapshot assessment of somebody you meet at a cafe or on the train. These are very snapshot, very knee-jerk reactions. This framework that we're talking about is absolutely rubbish for them, because there's no way this framework can overpower that kind of instinctive reaction. What it is good for, though, is system two thinking, which Kahneman sort of describes as deliberate, rational, considered thinking and choices. So there's this idea in economics in particular that every person, humans, are inherently system two rational. What Kahneman shows is that that's not really the case. System one is still a very powerful, arguably domineering part of our personality. But system two, the DURT framework, is really good for. System one, it's almost completely useless. So, there's some steps you can take from here. This is not a prescriptive process. The reason I'm presenting this kind of strange topic on a series of financial planning webinars, and as a side note, completely acknowledge that this is a really weird topic to bring up. Most financial planning webinars I have seen have been about, taxation benefits of different strategies, different product options, financial market updates. All of that stuff's important, but I've deliberately included this in our financial fundamentals phase because the way that you make decisions about money, the choices you make, and the maturity of the perspective you bring to the process will have a huge, bigger, I would argue, bigger impact on your financial outcome than anything else just about. Because if you're somebody who's prone to making, system one decisions about money, rash, emotional, swept up in the crowd, swept up in the noise, persuaded by TikTok and Instagram ads, you will be chasing your tail for years and years and years and not really get anywhere. So you're going to make lots of motion, but not a lot of progress. If instead the occasional decision, or you can approach these big choices and decisions using this kind of framework, and where it's a lot more system two, rational, deliberate, intentional, you will make better decisions. They won't always work out, but the decisions will be better. And more better decisions over a longer period of time will lead to a better financial outcome. Better than, maybe not better than buying Macquarie at the bottom of the market, but that kind of idea. So here's some steps you can take when you're approaching your next big decision. First one is have a think about your choice context. Think about those perspectives, histories, beliefs, goals, and objectives that you're bringing to the table when you're approaching that decision. And also be aware that yours will be different to your partners, to the person you're talking to the people at work, and even to your families. Generally, siblings tend to be the closest with their choice context because their formative experiences are generally very similar, but they diverge fairly rapidly after kind of everyone leaves the house and meets people. So then sketch out a DURT grid, and it's easy. It's a matrix, 2 lines: downsides, upsides, risks, and trade-offs. Note down 1 or 2 in each category. I've found you can go to umpteen levels of depth when it comes to assessing these categories, but I found 1 or 2 to be most useful because you're going to sort of put the big ones on there. You're not going to start with the risk that your postal address will change and therefore you'll need to update your super fund. Like that's a kind of a nothing risk. And then just see if it helps with the decision at all. I mean, look, there's a tension with all of us when we're making these decisions that we can fall into the trap of using a system 2 basis to justify our system 1 decision. But hopefully what this process helps you do is just be more deliberate around the choices you're making, have a consistent framework to help you make consistent decisions, and just bring some clarity and intentionality to the choices you're making about your money. In the background, this is how we give our advice. If you're expecting us to give you a straight up and down black and white answer about a financial question, it's very unlikely. More often than not, you will get from us, on balance, we believe that taking action ABC is in your best interest because after thinking about the downsides, upsides, risks, and trade-offs, we believe it to be in your best interest. Not quite as snazzy as buy this thing or sell that thing. So we'll leave it there. Thank you for persisting and listening to admittedly a very weird topic, but hopefully it's been of some use. Hopefully there's been some value there for you because, making better decisions, as I mentioned, will have a huge impact on your financial future and outcome. So there's my details. If you have any questions, any thoughts, if you want to query what I'm talking about, complain about it, compliment it, whatever, send through an email to hello@theadvicegallery.com.au. You can call me on 0431 664422 or check out the website, theadvicegallery.com.au. We go into a bit more detail there, and we are regularly posting our blogs and information over there. So on that note, thank you so much. Thank you for persisting. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please just get in touch. And I look forward to speaking to you soon. And I will see you at our next webinar, which I think is next Tuesday. All right. Thanks very much. Thanks again. Talk to you soon.